The 1970s might just be my favourite era of graphic design, and I'm going to show you why with 3 designers that I think you need to know about. Let's go! Hello friends, welcome to Flux Academy, the online design school. My name is Matt Brunton, and today we're going to be looking at some of the high points of graphic design history. I'm going to be sharing with you 3 of my all-time favourite designers, all of which were active during the 1970s. I remember it well. The first of which is Otl Aicher. Otto, as he was known, was born in 1922 in Germany, and he worked with a lot of the most famous German brand names like Lufthansa, the airline, and Braun. But he's most well known for his work on the 1972 Munich Olympics. And although this work was begun in the 1960s, it's associated, of course, with the 70s because the Olympics was in 72. So that's why I've included him here. And I have the style guide for the Olympic Games here. And it's a really interesting piece of work because you can see the detail and the precision that's gone into his work, his thought process, and his eye for detail and his love for the system and what that could do. And this became very influential on the whole notion of corporate identity over the following decades. This is the emblem he designed for the games, for the Munich Games. You can see here it's paired with the Olympic rings. Just a real unique symbol, but also something that remained very iconic and fit with this whole overall system. Even things like the Olympic rings weren't defined when the Olympic Committee sent them to him. So he created his own rules for the size of the rings and the relationships and things like that. And we have like the colour scheme here and just lots of incredible detail that goes all the way through the whole scheme. And these typographic layouts, how this should be displayed so that we always had consistent leading. You can see here this typeface is Universe. If you saw part 1 of this series, we talked about Adrian Frutiger, who designed Universe, and here it is in use for the Olympic Games, giving it this really consistent modernist look. But it was really interesting the way they talked about this game. So you've got to remember the historical context. This program was being developed in the late 1960s, barely 20 years since the end of the Second World War. And this was all about changing the perception of Germany and being a new modern Germany to move away from the horrors of the past. And it says this in the guidelines and the standards for the visual design, that this is how the Olympic Games should be perceived: cheerful, light, dynamic, non-political, non-dramatic, free of ideologies, a playful interaction of sport and culture. So this is very much the antithesis of National Socialism and everything that's happened in Germany. They wanted to present themselves as different. So they'd been very clear here when we're thinking about branding, how they want to be perceived. That was their strategy. These were their values. This was going to be the tone of voice that they were going to speak with. And then they thought about expressing that brand identity visually through the visual identity. And it says the elements of the visual identity should convey this image. These elements are the official emblem, which we've seen, the colours, typeface, typographic system, standard formats, organising principles. So this is an incredible influence on our modern notion of branding. First of all, figuring out how you want to be perceived, what your positioning is going to be and the reasons for that, and then making sure that is expressed in a consistent way so that the visuals tell that story. So these elements that have been chosen, like the emblem, the typography, and the way it all comes together, give you that kind of impression. And we see these rules all the way through. Even something like the colour scheme when it's played out into this mascot, this little dog. And it's really playful, it's interesting, but it also is restrained and appropriate in this whole modernist style. But these colours, you think about maybe the totalitarian regime and the colours in red and black and white and a lot of primary colours we think of as here. These colours were based on the landscape of Bavaria, the region where Munich is. So we've got a lot of colours of nature, but in a brighter hue, and this contributes to this cheerful feel that we talked about. We can see as well on screen, there's this great website, Munich 72 Collected, where they collect elements from the Munich games, the ephemera, and they showcase it, and they also sell a number of items as well. So if you want an original poster on your wall, check it out. I'm waiting for one of these stadium posters to come up. But what you can see is this system overall, it produces this effect by using the type and the type setting and the whole layout, as well as the color scheme and the elements like the emblem and the pictograms. Now, these were really important, and these have been much copied since, but these pictograms that were designed to represent the different sports, that's become an incredibly influential style of iconography, and this is why Otto is such an important designer. But as you see, all these different things from posters and programs, that all these elements are used and it produces the overall feel. This is a high point of identity design. This is that brilliant stadium poster. I'm jonesing for one of these on my studio wall. And even this ticket, I think this just sums it all up. This is a ticket for the football, and you can see here all the elements, the typography, the colour scheme, the emblem with the Olympic rings. We can see the grid layouts, the iconography of the pictograms. We see this line style illustration, the hierarchy, the grid structure. All those elements come together, and even in something like a ticket, which you might think it's a throwaway item, care has been taken, and that is what has really elevated this design. And this whole style is influenced by the next designer that I want to talk about, and that is Josef Müller-Brockmann. And he was a Swiss designer born in 1914, and he was a real pioneer in this whole area of modernism and grid layouts and restraint and this kind of typography. And this, in fact, is the title of this book, Pioneer of Swiss Graphic Design. Let me show you some of his work. This is a famous poster he did. There was a concert hall in Zurich where he did a whole program of posters, and they have become classics. And you'll have seen this style sort of copied and aped and inspired maybe recently. This whole style has come back. But when you talk about Swiss design, Josef Müller-Brockmann is one of the key figures. You'd probably put him in the top 3 or 5 figures that have defined what Swiss design, or this international style as it also called, represents. And throughout this whole series of posters, we see this style coming through, these grid layouts, this use of transitional typefaces, these geometric forms, a lot of restraint, but it produces a dramatic effect with the scale that is employed. Later, going into the late 1950s, we see more of this work as we start to use these different angles on the grid. Their film posters, a famous one that often comes up, as is this one here, this campaign poster from 1960. And you can see that although there's only 2 words and 1 colour over a black and white photograph, it's so dramatic because the choices are very deliberate, and it brings the appropriate feel, the tension to this piece. He was very active in the 1970s, despite beginning his career and doing a lot of things in the 1950s and 60s. As I said in the last video, people tend to work for longer than 10 years. So I've included him in the 1970s because during this time he was doing a lot of high-profile corporate work for international brands like IBM, carrying out Paul Rand's identity design system, and Olivetti as well. So he's involved in technology and cutting-edge companies during that period, supervising their design principles and also running his own consultancy, Müller-Brockmann & Co. And you can see a little bit of their work here and the kind of programs that they were involved in. A little bit more of his work for you, because it's all beautiful, isn't it? The last project of his I want to show here is for Swiss Railways, and public transport is one of those things. British Rail also is another famous identity design system. There's just so much scope there because of all the signage and the information and the things to be conveyed to create these sort of systems. And he created a very Swiss system, again, with things like pictograms, the consistent use of typography, and the rules that were within this system really helped establish a whole look for them. But I think the real reason why we need to know about Josef Müller-Brockmann is the influence of this whole style and his particularly his command of the grid. And he actually wrote a book on this that he must have been developing during the 70s. It came out in the early 80s, and this book is still a bestseller today, Grid Systems. And this the version you'll normally see is in English and German. It's a bilingual book, and there's incredible detail, if I just randomly flick through this book, of different grid layouts and why they should be applied in a certain way, how to set your margins so it looks more professional and it creates the right sort of tension and feel that you want. And this book goes into incredible detail about division of columns and also rules for typography, and it displays how these grids are in use in things like even the type design, and even his own pictograms here for Swiss Federal Railways make it into the book. So if you really want to get into the detail of grids, I really recommend this book. It is a classic, even though it's over 40 years old, it's still relevant. So particularly if you want to work in print, you want to do things like longer corporate brochures or programs, maybe for a theatre, you want to do book design, then I would say this is an essential book for that whole style and learning your craft and learning those details. So maybe if you didn't go to design school, it's one to pick up. If you did go to design school, I bet this was on your reading list, so you probably already have this guy. The final designer I want to talk about, who was very active in the 1970s and definitely moves through that whole same style, and we can see a lot of that modernist influence between all these designers, is Massimo Vignelli. And Massimo was born in Italy in 1931, but he moved to the United States and did a lot of work there and was very influential in taking the modernist style to the US and having this hybrid style with the American influences in his work. Let's have a look at the Vignelli canon. This book is it's a smaller book. It's not like one of those coffee table design books, but there's a lot of information in here. Vignelli writes this book himself and includes a lot of great quotes and principles in here. We see here is corporate identity for American Airlines. They did eventually replace this, but it lasted for a long time. And it's really interesting with Vignelli that for a lot of his identities, like American, Knoll, Heller, I believe it was, he used Helvetica Bold as the typeface for the wordmark for all these different identities. A lot of restraint there. And how can it be distinctive? But it was through the whole identity system and the whole production that he made the distinction, and he didn't need to go to choose wacky typefaces. In fact, he was in favor of just using a few. And there's some incredible principles. In fact, Vignelli was all about principles. He was all about design systems, and that is his big influence on today. It was his approach and his argument that modernism wasn't a style. In fact, he says here, quote, "We are definitively against any fashion of design and any design fashion. We despise the culture of obsolescence, the culture of waste, the cult of the ephemeral. We detest the demand of temporary solutions, the waste of energies and capital for the sake of novelty." I wonder what he'd think about today's social media generation, where he said he detests ephemera, you know, where we post something and a couple of hours later it's forgotten about, it's gone. But he says here, we are for a design that lasts. And he goes on to say, We strive for a design that is centered on message rather than visual titillation. We like design that is clear, simple, and enduring, and that is what timelessness means in design. This really speaks to me. I think nowadays there's just always a push towards the new and the novel and getting attention and make it move, make it louder, make it pop. Rand did a funny video on that. But I really think that this timelessness, when we have principles and real thought into what we do, and we create these systems, then we think about what we're supposed to do as designers. We're problem solvers. That is the whole point of design. Design needs to be functional as well as aesthetically pleasing, and that aesthetically pleasing nature of something is a function in itself because it makes it enjoyable to use. So we need to design things that work, and Vignelli was really committed to that and saw the beauty of that. And he talks about here about these basic typefaces. Out of thousands of typefaces, all we need are a few basic ones and trash the rest. I mean, there's even more today with anyone can upload a typeface for free. But knowing certain typefaces and getting to grips with them as a designer, knowing how to typeset them, how they work, and having that in your mind before you begin, sure beats scrolling through Illustrator, looking at hundreds of typefaces and kind of seeing which one catches your fancy. You see more of his work here. This time he's using Bedone in this system, and again how it creates consistency across it, but there's still lots of life in it because of the style. I've bookmarked a few other things. Here's one of the corporate identities I mentioned for Knoll, and we can see here again set in Helvetica Bold. And this work I think is really interesting for Griot New York. This looks very contemporary to me. We have this heavyweight condensed all caps sans serif paired with this serif typeface, this monochromatic scheme just using red and different tints and shades of red with the black. But this to me looks like something that could have been designed today and not 40 or 50 years ago, and that's timelessness. But I think Vignelli, as we sum him up, he's probably most famous for his work on the New York subway, and the map would be one key element of that. I have a diagram of it here. This is a 2008 version. I believe it was 1972 that he first designed a map for the New York subway, and they later abandoned it before coming back to Vignelli's design and employing his company again because they realized there was so much not only beauty but function to it in the design. And his designs on the subway have actually made it into art galleries. His design work's been elevated to the level of art. This is one particular exhibit which is on display at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, or part of their collection. You can see this sign here for Fifth Avenue, and this replaced a dizzying array of different signs that were kind of hung all over the place, as we see on this website here. And this was a whole confusing system, and Vignelli brought order to it, and now it's celebrated. And this iconic subway look that we see and that we know and that we recognize, and it's influenced so many other designs and just looks like New York and is something that tourists take pictures with, is something that Vignelli conceived, and it's celebrated today. Standards Manual, who produce these kind of reissues of these style guides like the Olympic one I showed you, have one for the New York City Transit Authority, and you see here scans of Vignelli and Bob Norder's modernist masterpiece. So they did this while they were at Unimark, which was Vignelli's company, and there's detail in here of the typeface that is being used and the way it would be set for the different stations down to the kerning. And look at this detail here with the kerning. It's real detail, but that's where the beauty is. It's in all these details, and Vignelli lived in those. And when you have a simple scheme, you need to be across the details to make sure that everything sings, and he was really committed to that. And this style became iconic, even down to the construction of things like an arrow. it has that same solid form. It looks really strong, bold and modern, how the sign should be laid out. And this whole system is a thing that is still celebrated today. You can probably tell that I enjoy sharing these stories, but would you like to hear more from graphic design history? If so, let us know down in the comments and we will give the people what they want. If you haven't seen part 1 from the 1960s, make sure you check that out. There's a link to that in the description, as well as links to our programs if you're interested in studying with us. And until next time, happy designing.